This is part 2 of 3 videos to determine the best cartridge for deer hunting. In this part you'll get the scores for each of the 6 performance metrics. Here's a link to part 1 if you haven't watched it and want to know more. I'll link to part 3 when it's ready if you want to skip straight to the overall results. However, I suggest you watch the series from start to finish to get all the nuances. Welcome to the Red Kettle channel. This is where you get updates on product development and tips and tricks for efficient hunting. This is part 2 in a series for finding the best cartridge for deer hunting, where we'll review the individual winners for each of the performance metrics. Let's get started. Metric number 1 is recoil energy. The 243 is a clear winner here, no surprise really. I ran these numbers based on the rifle and the scope combination weighing 8 pounds. Based on my experience with a 120 grain bullet, a cartridge like the 6.5 Creedmoor doesn't have a lot of felt recoil. So even if it's number 2, it's a good candidate for a low recoiling cartridge. It's worth mentioning that using the 6.5 Creedmoor on a 10-pound rifle will give you the same recoil energy as the 243 in an 8-pound rifle. And that could be a more versatile option if you want light recoil and don't have to lug your rifle around too much. Post in the comments if you'd like me to do a more in-depth review of a setup for light recoil. No surprise, the 30 caliber cartridges take the prize here when it comes to expanded cross-sectional area, which means the 308 and the 30-06 in this test. There's a lot of hype about cartridges and bullets that cause instant kills, drop in their tracks dead deer. And there's also a lot of talk about sleek, high BC bullets that buck the wind and retain energy at long range. 308 is not a candidate for any of those categories. And on top of that, the dependability and reliability of a large wound channel might not make the headlines. Well, you can call me old school, but I think it's a factor that's worth considering if you hunt large deer species. A bigger hole means a greater surface for bleeding and a bigger pipe for draining blood. In part 3, we'll put that into more context. Next is maximum point blank range for drop. In my book, you can categorize a shot into 3 scenarios. 1, a split-second point blank range shot. 2, a shot where you just need to adjust for bullet drop. And 3, a shot where you need to adjust for both bullet drop and wind drift. I'll create a more in-depth video on that topic, but for now I'll say that scenario 1 is the bread and butter of deer hunting and doesn't require any advanced equipment or skills. Scenario 2 is straightforward for anyone with a rangefinder, a ballistics app and a scope with adjustable turrets. You just need to be absolutely sure you know the limits set by wind conditions. Unless you shoot down a fire belt on a very calm day in open terrain, this is not an option you can always count on. Scenario 3 doesn't require more equipment than scenario 2, but requires an in-depth knowledge of wind conditions and how they're impacted by terrain, as well as significant practice. Very few hunters can pull that kind of shot off consistently. Anyway, more on that another time. Just to be clear, I based this series on scenario 1 when you need to be fast and don't have time to make any adjustments. So you have to work within your point blank range or use holdover at the most. It didn't surprise me that the 270 Winchester wins on point blank range. It's been known to be a flat shooting cartridge since Jack O'Connor started singing its praise. But as mentioned in part 1, this is not a metric you should use on its own, as we'll see when we get to winded point blank range in a moment. It's worth mentioning 2 things. The actual drop point blank range for the 270 Winchester, as per the specs of this test, is 300 yards. And it's 264 yards for the 308, which is the worst performer in this category. I think an extra reach of 37 yards is material if you shoot in open terrain, but I don't think the difference is material compared to the other cartridges in the test. As you can see from this graph, the difference is limited for most of the other cartridges. It's also worth mentioning that at a 2.5 mile/hour crosswind, which is not much, the wind becomes the limiting factor, not your bullet drop. And what does that mean for the scores? Let's look at windage maximum point blank range. Here, the 280 Remington is theoretically speaking the winner. And by the way, the ranking is the same for all wind speeds I checked. How material is the difference? Well, the worst performer in this group is the 243 Winchester. With that cartridge, you get about 20 yards less reach at all wind speeds I checked. And the 308 doesn't fare much better, to be honest. And I say that's material if you shoot in open country towards the limit of what you can do without dialing for wind. But the race is pretty close, practically speaking, when you compare it with other cartridges. I made the comparison based on a 6-inch vital zone and a 1 MOA accuracy. I'll do an in-depth video on windage point blank range and how you can use it to shoot faster. Let's see what happens to maximum point blank range when you decrease accuracy. Here's the 280 Remington with a 1 MOA group, which by the way requires a fair bit of practice when shooting from the ground in field positions. The windage maximum point blank range for a 5 mph crosswind is 235 yards. If the group size increases to 2 MOA, which is not unusual judging from what I see at the shooting range, the windage point blank range is 185 yards. And at 3 MOA and a 5 mph crosswind, the point blank range is down to 150 yards. Remember, this is based on a 6-inch vital zone and accounting for the maximum group size at each given range. That is a material difference. This emphasizes that as hunters, we can't buy performance. We need to practice and we need to know the limitations of our skills and equipment. Let's move to the next category, velocity. The winner of this group is the 270 Winchester. No real surprise here, as it's a cartridge with the biggest ratio between powder and bullet weight. As mentioned in part 1, velocity gives us a good idea of how fast and how much a bullet will expand, among other things, which is particularly important when we're hunting smaller deer species, because we don't have too much space to work with, all things being equal. I'm saying all things being equal because of course you can manage expansion through bullet choice, but here we're comparing cartridges like for like using the same bullet. Let's set that discussion aside for another day. In this test, the 308 is the slowest expanding cartridge. Is it bad for deer? Definitely not. Firstly, you need to consider that the 308 has a greater frontal area, which will probably increase the expansion speed. And secondly, it's all about context. Slow expansion is better for larger animals, so the lower velocity doesn't mean good or bad. It just means potentially better for specific scenarios. More on that in part 3. The final category is kinetic energy. The winner here is unsurprisingly the 30-06, as it has the heaviest bullet and the most powder. By the way, the ranking is the same all the way out to 300 yards. One interesting observation is that energy-wise, the 308 almost manages to catch up with the 270 Winchester at 300 yards, based on the specs of this test. As mentioned in part 1, kinetic energy indicates the bullet's ability to perform work. Some folks, including Colorado Parks and Wildlife, refer to kinetic energy thresholds for different size animals. 1,000 foot-pounds force for a deer and 1,500 for an elk. I don't think that anyone ever asked deer or elk about these limits. Still, in my experience with these sizes of animals, they're good pointers to see how adequate a cartridge is. And remember, the objective here is not how little we can get away with, but what we can use to create an adequate margin of error for ourselves. It's worth mentioning that all cartridges based on these metrics are adequate for deer out to and beyond their point blank range. But the 243 is starting to run close, and if you're shooting big mature male deer at longer ranges and oblique angles, I'd be careful with the 243 and regular soft-nosed bullets. Conversely, if you're shooting a smaller deer up close, 30-06 might be more stick than you need. So that concludes the individual scores. Let's consider the practical applications in relation to the practical distances we've seen the cartridges are capable of, and a relative size of deer with crossover capability for smaller and larger animals. Watch part 3 if you want to see all that. I'll post a link here as soon as it's ready, and I'll post it in the best cartridge for deer hunting playlist.